So welcome back. You're going to have a nice long day today. Relaxing day. Lots of fun, right? So we'll try to insert a few breaks every once in a while, but also please just let me know if you want to discuss something or add something or ask something anytime during the presentation. So I hope that you'll also not just ask me to do all the talking here today. I've divided this next section into two presentations, but it's about the same. It's about once the project starts, what are the financial tasks and how could you solve them? But I try to first give you an overview of what the tasks are. And then later on, I have another presentation which gives you perhaps a little bit more practical tips on how you can deal with particular issues. And this time I'll also say a little bit about where I'm from and who I am, since I didn't do that yesterday. This is where my university is on the global map. I don't know whether you can see it, but our main campus is in Norway, in a city which is not in Oslo. It's called Trondheim. It's about 500 kilometers north of Oslo. Our daylight today is from about 3:30 in the morning to 11 o'clock at night. Yeah. But in the winter, it's the opposite, right? So in the winter, the shortest day in the winter is just 4 hours. So we're paying for it in the winter anyway. And just for your information, when I was a kid, I used to live in the Arctic in Norway for 8 years, in a place where you had 2 months in the summer with 24-hour sunshine and 2 months in the winter with no sunshine at all. And people react differently to that. Some get depressed, others don't care. We're all different. So anyway, we come from different parts of the world. Our university also has an office in Tokyo. And recently we established a collaboration with a region in China. So we also have an office there now. And we have an office in Brussels. And our slogan is knowledge for a better world. In Norway, we merged with 3 higher education colleges 2 years ago. So now we have campuses in 3 cities in Norway. And the distance from Trondheim, which is our main campus, to the city of Gjøvik is something like 350 kilometers. So it's quite a long distance relationship, to put it like that. And if you want to have meetings, you generally use Skype, or you have to travel quite a bit. So Gjøvik is sort of in the interior part of southern Norway. Ålesund is on the western coast of Norway. So that city is very oriented towards the maritime sector, shipping, offshore activities and stuff like that. But it's also very good at innovation and collaboration with the business community. They have a very strong culture for that in that part of Norway. Basically, the core of the university used to be science and engineering. And it used to be that all the civil engineers in Norway were educated at our university in the past. But now we cover all the basic disciplines. We also have a medical faculty and close relationships with the university hospital in Trondheim and so on. And we have all the other main areas of science and education. So we have 8 faculties, about 55 departments. Number of full-time equivalent staff last year was the number you see here, 7,100. About 40,000 students last year. 6,800 bachelor's and master's degrees completed the year before. 366 doctoral degrees or so 2 years ago. And our budget converted to euros based on the exchange rate, I guess, of the end of that year was roughly 875 million euros. And out of that, 210 million was externally funded research, basically. Okay, let me just see. These are the areas where how the students are divided, but when you count the students in different areas. I won't spend a lot of time on that. We have a lot of focused research activities in various fields at our university. At the moment, or quite recently, we passed 106 Horizon 2020 projects. We still have a few, at least one FP7 project that hasn't been finished, but we're getting to the end of that. So far, we have been awarded 55 million euros in grants in Horizon 2020. And in Norway, we are the institution which has the highest funding from the National Research Funding Agency. Okay, and then there you see at the bottom some of the fields of research that we have strategic focus areas: energy, health, oceans, sustainability, biotechnology, digital area, and nanotechnology. Just one slide about what my background is. I had a bachelor's degree in environmental and resource studies and comparative development studies. Then I took a master's of science degree in economics and business administration after having worked for a few years. I've been in one kind of research administration now for 22 years. I was for 2 periods elected internal auditor of EARMA. For those of you who don't know what EARMA is, you can check the website. It's the European Association for Research Managers and Administrators. And I'm currently active in BESTPRAC, including here today. So to the financial management, the financial management once a project starts. I have a couple of slides that relate to the grant preparation stage, which Wolfram spoke about. So I'm not trying to repeat what he said, but I'm adding a couple of aspects that are in the transition to starting up the project. But primarily, it's about the implementation stage for the project. And some of the keywords here would be how to prepare for the startup of the project, how to set it up in your system, how are payments managed in Horizon 2020, if you haven't seen how that happens or if that's new to you. Monitoring financially and in relationship to progress in the project, and budget reallocations. So I'm showing a different version of the project lifecycle here, where I've left out this first stage from the other model, the monitoring of funding opportunities. Just to highlight that here, we're talking about the startup of the project and the implementation stage. And I've listed some of the key tasks there, and also in this representation. Just to mention keywords here, from project startup, it's setting up in the system, internal information and procedures, transfer of pre-finance. That's what you do at the startup stage as key tasks. In the implementation stage, you have continuous bookkeeping in the accounts, time recording, monitoring of costs versus budget, periodic report, which I'm not going to speak about reporting today because that's a separate presentation by the runner later on. So I'm not going to say anything about reporting to the EU. I will say a little bit about budget reallocations and also the overall payment schedule. Okay, it doesn't always respond when I expect it to. In the grant preparation stage, what I would like to add for the grant preparation stage, one aspect of consortium agreements is also something that became gradually more of an issue as Horizon 2020 developed, and that was for Marie Skłodowska-Curie actions, where you have networks. mostly with the so-called ITNs. Do any of you have Marie Skłodowska-Curie actions? Nobody? Yeah, you do? Good. Perhaps some of you will get some in the future, so perhaps you would like to know what to do then. It used to be called the ideas in the past. Now it's excellent science. Yeah, together with ERC. Yeah. But okay, maybe I should say one sentence about what this animal is. Marie Skłodowska-Curie actions is about mobility and career development for researchers. The most widely used version of it, I believe, is, or actually maybe it's not. One common version is one's called ITN, Innovative Training Networks. And then there's three sub-varieties of ITNs. I'm not going to name them all by name because it's impossible to remember them anyway, but just remember there are three versions of ITNs. They are networks where you have a consortium. And it's in the beginning, it was not compulsory to have a consortium agreement. If you looked in a grant agreement, the Commission said that's up to you, but now it's compulsory. And there are good reasons to have consortium agreements. One good reason, not the only one, but one from a financial point of view, is that the Commission says in the grant agreement that it's okay if the consortium divides the budget differently between them from what's in the grant agreement. And you don't have to amend the grant agreement. You just leave the budget as it is in the grant agreement, but you can still change it around between partners in the consortium. That's for two of the cost categories to the right in the budget table, which is grouped under the heading institutional costs. So for that reason, from a financial point of view, it's important to have a consortium agreement as well. And that's something, when you get to this stage, you should get working on right away. As soon as you know that you've been invited to the grant preparation, get working on that right away. And I'll show you the template that I personally would recommend that you use for that purpose. There's another issue, financial validation. Any time you have a new partner in a consortium, so you may have been through it yourself. If you later on become a coordinator and you have other partners who have never been part of Horizon 2020 or FP7 before, they also need to be validated. That takes time. So that's another issue. If you're a coordinator and you get to this stage, you get invited to grant preparation, check if there is any partner in your consortium that has not been validated and make that a priority to help them with that. And final issue, again, back to Marie Skłodowska-Curie actions, is recruitment of researchers. It's not uncommon that partners start too late with that. Formally speaking, depending on national and local institutional regulations, but in our university, we could start announcing positions as soon as we are in this stage, because we can complete the entire recruitment procedure for researchers, for PhD students, as long as we don't sign the employment contracts. That's the only thing that has to wait until we have the grant agreement signed. That's our case. But we see that it's not unusual that this causes a delay in projects, that partners start too late with this. Okay. I don't know where to point. Is this running out of battery, perhaps, or the receiver is in the projector, right? Oh, the receiver is there. Okay. So I should point at you, right? But it's still not reacting. So any thoughts on this while we're waiting for the technical issues?
Yeah, I would just say that we just finished the 7th framework ITN project with you. I'm not exactly you, but NU was the coordinator.
Okay.
And it was a great process.
Yeah, what was the acronym of? Tempo, yeah. Okay, Tor Arne is the professor at our university. Yeah, he's...
We're communicating with Andreas.
Yeah, my colleague, yeah. So you're ready for the next one, right?
Always.
Yeah. Yeah, that was FP7, right? Yeah. So the rules, since we're on the subject, I can mention that the rules changed for this kind of project from FP7 to Horizon 2020 regarding reporting and regarding audits. So if you have, like, when you get to your Horizon 2020 ITNs, don't expect to do it exactly the same way as in FP7. Yeah. I could mention, yeah, on financial validation, there is something in the Commission called the validation service. That's the unit that is responsible for taking care of validation of new participants, new beneficiaries in Horizon 2020. We have had cases where they have not responded very quickly to partners that needed validation when we were the coordinator. So sometimes it's useful to ask the project officer for your project to help you if the validation service is late in replying and helping the partners, just as a practical tip. And what validation is about, yeah, there's a web page on that, and it also mentioned in the Horizon 2020 online manual what needs to be validated and what kind of documentation you need to provide for the validation. So that's the web page to consult. I could say a couple of words about the Marie Skłodowska-Curie Consortium agreements, since I don't have details on it in any of the slides today, but the template that I am going to recommend in a slide later today, it's produced by something called LIRU. That's the League of European Research Universities. They took the DESCA template, which I'm also going to recommend. The DESCA template is for normal Horizon 2020 projects like RIAs and EAs and CSAs. Research and innovation actions, and coordination and support actions. That's a consortium agreement developed by a body called DESCA. LIRU took that template and adapted it to Marie Skłodowska-Curie actions. And from a financial point of view, one of the additions is in the financial provisions, which is chapter 7 in the DESCA template, is the financial stuff. It's called financial provisions. In the LIRU template for Marie Skłodowska-Curie actions, great, thank you. I just finished this sentence and we'll get back to the presentation. In the LIRU template, they've added a paragraph on principles for this budget reallocation that I talked about for one of these budget categories called management and indirect costs. So it's not the finished text, but it has the sort of the structure where you could put in your numbers on this. In our university, we've added another paragraph, which is not part of the LIRU template, which is about how to allocate the other category of institutional costs, which is called research, training, and networking activities. The LIRU template doesn't mention that. Our adaptation does, because the consortium is also allowed to reallocate that part of the budget. But maybe I'll stop this digression now that we have the technical issues resolved, and we can get back to it if we have time later on. So this is where we were at the grant preparation stage. When we get to the project startup, and we're within one organization now, just in our university or company or research institute, What we need to do is provide our banking information to the coordinator. I'll tell you later on from the coordinator side of point of view what to ask for. So then you'll get the answer to what you have to provide as a partner. Then you have to set up the project in the accounting system. And this is something I also mentioned yesterday. What kind of structure you could have. I'll get back to that in the practical tips later on. And you have to establish the timesheet procedures internally and make sure that people follow them. So you have to communicate to all the people who are going to work on the project. This is how you produce timesheets in our organization. And you have to receive the pre-finance and take care of that internally so that it's booked correctly in your accounts. From the consortium point of view, the coordinator needs to collect the banking information from all the partners. In the practical tips later on, I'll get more into detail on what to collect. And also the coordinator needs to distribute the pre-finance. There are several ways of doing that. I'll get back to that in payments. Also, the coordinator should, when the project starts, get an agreement in the consortium on how are we going to monitor the project internally. You don't start a 3 or 4 year project, have a kickoff, and then go home and work for 3 years and then report. That's not how you work here. You have to report periodically internally to make sure that we are on track and that we're not delayed and that there are not things that should be done that weren't done and so on. And we also have to monitor costs versus budget to see that all the partners still have a budget to finish a job. If they don't, you have an issue, for instance. So internal monitoring is important, and one should agree on how often are we going to report and what are we going to report, and preferably also a template for that. Sometimes that might be written in a consortium agreement, but I don't see that being the normal way to do it. Here are some of the key tasks summarized. And I'll get now more into detail about payments. How does payments flow and now we're talking about consortia. So I'm not talking about an ERC project, which is normally just one partner. Their payments is a simple, straightforward thing. Everything goes from the EU to that one partner. I'm talking about projects which has consortia with several partners. So the funding flows like this, from the European Commission to the coordinator, from the coordinator to all the partners. There are 3 categories of payments. So there are 3 names for 3 different kinds of payments from the Commission. There's pre-financing, interim payments, and payment of the balance. The purpose of the first one, the pre-financing, is just to provide, to help partners with the cash flow, to help them with their liquidity, so that they have cash to pay for costs. But you could call it an interest-free loan because it's not your property. When you get the pre-finance, it's still the Commission's property. They just lend you the money, and it's not your property before the end of the project, after the final report has been approved. That's when it's possible for the Commission to calculate, okay, these are the costs that we actually accepted for your organization. So now we know what is your property from the pre-financing. I included a formula to explain what is the amount of the pre-finance normally. This is where you have several reporting periods, and above a certain size, then you take the number of periods and divide the maximum grant by that number. But don't get confused, because you see the name pre-finance and you expect, okay, that's what the Commission will transfer. That's not true, because they take 5% of the whole grant, not 5% of this pre-finance, but 5% of the whole grant, and they put it in something called the guarantee fund. So what they transfer is the pre-financing minus that guarantee fund contribution, so that there is no confusion about that. So if you want to do like a cash flow simulation, you have to take that into account. The interim payments, they are simply calculated from what are the costs that the Commission has accepted for each reporting period. And when that's transferred, that is the consortium's property. I might mention right away that if you ask the Commission, and if you read the documents, the Commission does not really care how the consortium divides the EU funding internally. They don't, in theory and in formal terms, it's not their business and they don't care. So in the extreme case, I mean, it's never going to happen, but from reading the rules, the consortium could agree to give all the EU funding to one partner, regardless of whose costs were, or what the costs were for each partner. And that is why in Horizon 2020 you don't have this report anymore, which you had in FP7, which was called, you were supposed to distribute this report at the end of the project, and it was called the distribution of the EU contribution. They don't need that information now because they don't care. What they do care about is how much they are going to fund for the consortium. How the consortium divides it, it's up to them, basically. So from that point of view, the interim payment is the consortium's property from the point of view of the Commission, because those are accepted costs. And you keep getting interim payments up to a certain amount, then it stops. And that amount is 85% of the max grant. Why 85%? That's a number that you don't see in the EU documents. You see 5% that I mentioned, and you see 90%. So the Commission says that the sum of the pre-financing and the interim payments cannot exceed 90% of the max grant. That means because they keep 5% of the pre-financing, the maximum that they would transfer in cash terms is 85% of the max grant. So the final 15% will be a negative cash flow for the consortium until the final report has been approved, which will be typically 4 or 6 months after the end of the project, something like that. So that is how the numbers are calculated and what the so the last transfer from the Commission is actually 2 transfers. One is called the final payment, which is, okay, how much is left from the max grant that we have accepted in costs and which we haven't transferred before or put into the guarantee fund. So that's the final payment. So that's one transaction, and then there is a separate transaction, which is a guarantee fund contribution. So they go from the Commission to the coordinator as 2 separate transactions, actually. And as I've said somewhere else, the max grant is the max grant. You can never get more, you can always get less. So that depends on what costs are accepted. So I'll give you an example. I used Excel to just illustrate by a chart how the cash flow could work. Here you see the red columns are the transfers from the Commission to the coordinator. Those are the red columns in the back, which are just 4 bars. And then if you have 6 months periods here, the blue bars are the timing of the costs. So if you do a linear chart out of this, the blue line is accumulated costs, the one that rises gradually as a linear function towards the end. The stepped function that rises, which is red, is the accumulated EU funding, which is transferred to the coordinator. And then the zigzag green line at the bottom is the net cash flow to the consortium. So that is, you have the zero line, the baseline, near the green line, sort of the green line crosses the zero value at the bottom here. So that's how the cash flow would work, sort of schematically demonstrated in a project like this. So far, I've talked about the cash flow from the consortium point of view. The question is, will this always look like this for each partner in the consortium? And my answer is not necessarily, and I'll explain why. The first sentence that many people see and focus on in the EU guidelines regarding payments from the coordinator to the partners is this first sentence. The coordinator must distribute blah, 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 blah without unjustified delay. And a lot of people, they just stop, they don't read anything else, and they assume that that means typically in 30 days the coordinator is obliged to transfer everything to the partners. But then later on in the guidelines, there is another sentence which says how and when the payments are distributed is in principle an internal matter for the consortium, which means that in the consortium agreement, you can agree on a different payment schedule. And that is what we normally do when we are the coordinator. We still provide a positive cash flow, but we don't distribute everything at once. We divide it into 6-month installments as a coordinator. So that, okay, the partners, the charge would in principle look something like this, but with the steps would be smaller each time, and then there would be more steps on the chart. But as long as we have a positive contribution from the EU in terms of in cash flow terms, the partners will also have that, but not with such a large amount as what we received from the Commission. Why do we do that? Okay, I'll just summarize here. There are two schools of thought on this issue. And the first one is to distribute everything at once. The second is to divide it into installments. And reasons why we do not distribute everything at once are the ones, some of them are mentioned here. First of all, we want to give partners an incentive to perform, to do their job in the project, and to link this to payments. So we write in the consortium that if you don't provide the information that is needed for report, we are entitled to withhold payments to our partner, because we've written that into the consortium agreement. But that's not actually the most important reason. The most important reason is that changes happen in the consortium. Partners agree to shift work between partners, transfer tasks between partners, and that means also transferring budget. And you may suddenly have to replace a partner. A partner decides to withdraw voluntarily, or in some cases is kicked out because they're not performing, and you have to find a new partner or reallocate budget within the remaining partners. So there are lots of reasons why you need to reallocate budget. If we have transferred everything from the pre-finance to the partners at the time, based on the budget at the time, it takes a lot more time for us as a coordinator to be able to get hold of some funding to give to somebody who's taking over work from another partner. That could take months or even years. And that causes major delays in adapting to changes in the consortium. If all the money is spread out, because some partners are sticking to their and holding on to the money even if it's not theirs. So we want to find ways of making sure that the consortium can adapt quickly. We hold back some funding. If a new partner is added, we still have funding available that we can transfer to the new partner. If one partner is taking over somebody else's job, we still have some funding available that we can transfer for their additional costs. So these are some of the reasons. And also, towards the end of the project, it happens, and it's not rare, that partners are seriously spending a lot less than the budget. And at least in terms of the costs that are accepted by the Commission, the number is so much lower than the budget for this partner that when the final report has been submitted and approved, they owe money. And they have to send money back that we transferred to them earlier on. We have had cases where that has taken several years to get that money back. And so that's another reason why we have this 6 months installments. It's much less likely that the partner would end up having to pay back a few €100,000, which is difficult or impossible for them to do, according to their own statements. So these are some of the reasons. You might think, okay, but there is this guarantee fund. Is that going to solve this problem for you? And the answer is often no. And that's because the guarantee fund is only, first of all, it is only active as long as the project is not finished. After the end of the project, the guarantee fund does not work or is not applicable to your project anymore after the end dates or after the final report has been approved. And the other thing is the guarantee fund, as long as the Commission is not owed any money, the guarantee fund is not applicable. So then it's the consortium's problem, is what the Commission is arguing. So these are some, there are limitations to how, in what situations the guarantee fund can be of any help. It's basically if you're in the middle of the project and a partner goes bankrupt or something like that. And the project is still going to proceed and continue. That's where you could get help from the guarantee funds. So everything is clear about payments now? Any questions? How do you do it? Any? Yeah? You hold it back?
Same way we're holding back the funds.
Yeah?
And in some other programs, when there's equipment and it has to be purchased at the beginning of the project, we deduct the whole amount of the equipment in order to be sure that they will not spend those funds for some other expenses. So
Okay.
when they conduct the procedure of procurement for the equipment, then we will transfer the funds for the equipment, not before.
Okay.
And we are only giving them the rest of the funds when they provide us with the documents to justify the funds that was previously paid to them. So we are actually making sure that they will provide us with documentation for the specification of costs, not only for them, but for us as well.
Yeah, good. It's interesting to hear your solution to the equipment procurement procedure, because maybe we've been too generous in that regard. We have in our budget tool we have sort of a separate column for startup costs that are sort of taking out of the normal periodization of costs and put up as a front loading of the project. But we've not been as strict as you in terms of getting them to document that they've followed all the procedures and actually sign the agreement. So that's good. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyone else? Anyone else who do it in a different way? So you ready for a new topic then? You have all the funding that you need to get on to the next topic? Yeah? Okay. So this is about product follow-up or monitoring. Why do we monitor projects? What should we look for? The financial perspective on project monitoring, and the issue of following up cost versus budget, and the progress report as keywords. Why should we and why do we monitor projects? We need to identify early warning signals, things that we need to deal with that sort of threaten the progress of the project before it becomes impossible to do anything about it. If you leave things unresolved, it may kill the project, or it may be very costly to fix the problem or cause a major delay. So that's why you need to monitor things continuously or periodically to catch the early warning signals and then do something about it. The earlier you spot something, the easier and cheaper it is to fix, is a general principle. Okay. So these are some of the things we should be looking for, and we can think of the first items here as from the internally within one organization from the beneficiary perspective. Look for ineligible costs or non-eligible costs. So periodically, as a financial support person, what we should do is pull out the report and check the transactions, or are there any transactions here that look suspect or don't seem to fit with the project and should be checked more closely. There may be costs that somebody has incurred without talking to the principal investigator and should not be covered by the project, or have been booked to this project by mistake, just should be booked somewhere else. And one should also look for significant deviations from plan and from budget. As I said, things that may threaten the successful completion of the project. Ask the question, is there a need to change the plan or change the budget? Do we have any ideas on what kind of changes to make? Internally, we could go to the principal investigator in our organization and take the report and say, okay, maybe you should ask the court, or some project budget reallocations can be done internally, others not, so I'll get more into that later. But the steps are, you first go internally to the principal investigator with a suggestion. Maybe we should try to do a budget reallocation here to move. Like for instance, let's say we forgot to put a number in the budget for subcontracting, and then suddenly when somebody procures a service, then you discover actually this is subcontracting according to EU rules, but we don't have budget for it. That would be one situation where you could easily end up proposing to change the budget, basically. And then the question is, how far do you have to go to get this approved? That's another discussion. So again, more details on from the financial point of view, what to look for. I mentioned non-eligible costs. I mentioned also, you look at the budget for this project, and based on your knowledge of the project, you ask the question, aren't there costs that should be here which are not here? And the typical example would be missing personnel costs. People haven't charged, they haven't completed timesheets, for instance. Hours have not been charged to the project. The budget says that there should be like 18 person months worth of cost here. It's only 6. How do you explain that? And check if there are timesheets missing or other reasons why these personnel have not been charged to the project. And look for deviations. Are the costs a lot higher or a lot lower than the budget? And how do we deal with that? And are there any costs that, again, are missing from your budget? You could do, yeah. Yeah, sure.
What if I have a person on my project and he or she has a contract with me
Yeah.
on my project, but it is paid from the other one? Mistake in the system. So what happens then?
Okay, and you know that the costs should be charged to the project that is mentioned in the contract?
Yes.
Yeah. Internally, I would just rebook all the costs in the accounting system. And how you do it depends on your system. In our system, we can do a procedure to actually change the recording in the accounts from this project number to that project number. Exactly, but again, I don't.
It's the problem that every project has its own account. It's not the one for the organization, but every project has its own. Then you have to transfer money from one account to another.
Do you have separate accounts for each project in your organization?
In my organization, there are 2 or 3 projects, but
Yeah.
every project has its own account.
When you say account, do you mean bank account?
Bank account.
Okay, that's different.
From me and the other accounts for every project.
So you have a separate bank account for each project? Okay. That's more complicated. And I would just speculate based on my own general knowledge, and I suggested first I would correct I would do a transfer between the bank accounts, basically. I would transfer out of one bank account to the other bank account by bank transfer. And then I would make sure that the booking in the accounting system matches that. Yeah.
Only have to check if it is Serbian accounting system. You have it at National Bank of Serbia or Treasury administration. Because if one account is at Treasury and the other is at the National Bank of Serbia, they will not allow the transfer. But if it's both accounts are at Treasury or the National Bank of Serbia, they will allow the transfer accounts. And also to correct the bookkeeping, the general ledger entries in your accounting costs.
Are you also from Serbia, so you are in this situation?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that's a level of complexity that is new to me. So you have some bank accounts with the National Bank?
Serbia, and
Yeah.
they decided that all the new accounts are going to be opened at the Treasury administration.
Okay.
So we have some old bank accounts at the National Bank and the new ones at the Treasury. But the transfer between those 2 institutions are not allowed.
Okay.
They're not aware, we don't know why, but they are not allowing that.
Okay. Then you have an issue.
And some public institutions and governmental institutions.
Yeah.
For the companies, they have their accounts at the commercial banks. And
Yeah.
every transfer is okay.
Yeah.
to them.
Okay.
This is only for the governmental
Yeah.
accounts.
Yeah. Okay. It's interesting. I mean, it sounds like you have an issue. At least if you are in the situation with having those 2 accounts in a different national bank and the treasury. Do you know that, or is that something you have to check?
I need to check, but I have in euros account in the national bank, and then it's in local currency in the treasury, and then it's
Yeah.
reports from both banks and local.
Yeah, and then you will get like the exchange rate issue in addition to that, because the exchange rate probably fluctuates, right? So you'll get transactions at different exchange rates. Sorry. Sorry about that. Oh, I'm sorry I couldn't give you a clear answer because, yeah. That's a good thing about networks. You know, you always meet somebody who you could discuss with. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Yeah. Excuse me. Could we? Yeah.
Do you recommend having your separate bank accounts for each project, or is it one bank account, or you have several?
We have something in between. We have a few bank accounts, but from as far as this discussion is concerned, we have two. We have our ordinary bank account, which almost everything goes through our ordinary bank account, except European funding for European projects that we get from the Commission. And where we are, so when we are either the only partner and we don't have a consortium, or if we are the coordinator of a consortium, we have a separate bank account for that, which is denominated in euros to eliminate the exchange issue. So then all the funding from the Commission, which, for instance, for consortia that we coordinate, is transferred to this one bank account in euros, but it's just one. And it's for all the European funding that we are going to receive from the Commission and transfer either to our own ordinary bank account or to other partners. Everything else is just on one bank account. But we have a project accounting system, and we also have basically, so we track all the transactions to individual projects.
So by accounting, not by separate bank?
No. Yeah. But I would stress, because I have that in a different slide later on, that for organizations like ours, which is not in a Euro country, when we are the coordinator, I would strongly recommend to have a Euro-denominated bank account when you are the coordinator, even in cases like ours where we have our own currency. Mm-hmm. Any other comments, issues? Should we finish the issue of monitoring and then take a break? Yeah? Okay. Take a break now? No? Okay. You could do this project monitoring in a detailed way or in a very bird's eye view kind of way, or something in between. You could have a low level of detail, a low level of complexity by just looking at two numbers, basically. What have we spent and how much is left? Two numbers. We spent, and you could measure this in terms of funding or costs, i.e. euros, and in terms of amount of work, i.e. hours or person months. So that would give you four numbers. That's the easy, low complexity way of doing it. How much have we spent? Euros and person months. How much is left? Euros and person months. That's the really easy, simple way. Then the intermediate, the medium level, would be to look at planned versus actual. How much did we plan to spend as of now in terms of person months and euros? How much did we actually spend? Are we above or below in terms of person months and in terms of costs? And then there is an even more fancy way, which I'm not going to explain. I don't think anyone here is going to use it, and we don't use it. There is something called earned value management, which also tracks the planned value of what you've done so far versus the actual value of what you've done so far. Okay. So if we look at how to do this internally within one partner, one organization, the beneficiary level, What we can measure then is the cost versus budget in total, just one number, and ask the question, do we have enough left in the budget to finish the job, basically, or do we have a problem? Do we have, is the remaining budget too low for the remaining work? And we could measure actual versus planned costs, and actual versus planned effort. We could also look at this issue, have the people that work for the project, are they in a different staff category from what was planned? Like, did we put all the budget for a professor, but a PhD is doing the work, or the other way? Because that would have cost implications. It may have implication in terms of how much work can actually be done, and so on. And also, again, look for, did we have costs that fit into a category that we don't have in our budget? I mentioned subcontracting. A new issue is this category, internally invoiced costs, which is something that came up about a year ago. For the consortium, when you are the coordinator and you take care of this for the consortium as a whole, the same questions that are raised in the previous slide apply also at the consortium level. But in addition to that, I would suggest to monitor, are there signs that the budget is not balanced well between partners? Very often in the proposal stage, people are in a hurry to submit, and they are in a hurry to focus on the proposal text, and the budget is not always the first thing they want to spend time on and to discuss, and so often shortcuts are taken when the budget is produced, and that may have the implication that when the project starts to run, you realize that some partners have a very tight budget, which is not really enough for their job, and other partners have an unnecessarily generous budget. And we'll get back to reallocation later, but look for signs of that as well, and start thinking about what to do with that issue if you see that this is happening in the consortium. Okay, I'll just give you a few slides here of how you could do this. We would use Excel for this to produce Excel spreadsheets where we input information and then calculate deviations, calculate the kind of indicators that I mentioned earlier in this low, medium, high matrix here. I mentioned indicators that we should look for, and then you could produce your own Excel tools. This is adapted to FP7, and then for Horizon 2020, you could have one version here which sort of has the basic cost categories in the budget table, and then measures towards the end how this is the low complexity version, how much is left in your budget. And here is also a more detailed version where you look at, yeah, I actually can't read it from here. Yeah. We'll get back to other versions where we combine the financial monitoring with monitoring of progress in the project. Because I would suggest that those things should be viewed together and in relationship to each other, the financial monitoring and the progress monitoring in the project. But we'll get back to this then. So monitoring progress in the project. Some of these issues are normally not something that the financial support person takes care of, but I'm just mentioning it here sort of to give you the context. One should always track for each period, also internal monitoring period, which are more frequent than the reporting period to the year. Have we completed the tasks on time? Have we delivered the deliverables on time? Or do we have delays? And for any tasks and deliverables that are remaining, we could also measure, I'm not saying everybody does, but one common measurement is % complete that you see in some ways of doing it, some templates. It's also an indicator that's fairly simple, but then you would typically ask the researcher to estimate, okay, how many % of this task is complete as of today, or as of this reporting period. And ask for, are there any, first, you have, when you come to delays, the first thing is delays that are actual and realized because this task was due, this deliverable was due 2 months ago, but it hasn't been completed. That's a realized delay. But you also have expected delays. Something that has a deadline 6 months from now in the future, but you know that you're not going to make that deadline. So that's what we would call an expected delay. So one should also look for that, not just for the delays that are a fact, but also those that you expect in the future. And you could also look at time remaining versus remaining tasks and deliverables. Okay, you know that you only have 12 months left of the project, but we have all this work to do. Are we able to do it, or will we have delays? So this is one way of demonstrating how project progress and finance fits together, and it's a totality. And then I would suggest ways that you could monitor and measure those in combination in simpler or more complex ways. So when you ask progress and financial follow-up combined, you could look at indicators such as remaining budget versus remaining time. And here I'm not talking about person months, but calendar time is one indication. Like for instance, if many projects that do the periodization simplified, periodization of the budget, they just do a linear flat periodization of the budget, and then you measure cost against that flat periodization. You could argue that you should not use a flat linear baseline periodization, but an actual fluctuating periodization. But I don't think it's what most projects do. But if you do that, whatever periodization you do, and you measure the remaining budget versus the remaining time, you could also find if they clash or match each other well. Like if you have a 4-year project, 3 years complete, and you spent 75% of the budget, everything looks fine if you expect the costs to be the same all the time. But if you spend 90% of the budget and you have 25% of the time remaining, then you have an early warning signal. But it may be that a researcher, if you go and ask the researcher, will tell you, yeah, but that's fine because we don't have that much work to do in the last year. But the question should be asked anyway. So, and these are things to look for. And this is a simple measurement, which gives one question to ask to the researcher, remaining budget versus remaining time. Another is remaining budget versus remaining tasks and deliverables. Or you could use remaining budget versus remaining planned person months, for instance. Like maybe in your case, okay, your budget is for 200 person months. You have already reported 180 person months. So you only have 20 person months left in your budget. but you know that you have 50 person months left of work to do, then you have another issue. And again, you can use these indicators and take them to the researcher and ask these questions and get them to think about this and whether they can get this to work or not. And then the other measurements that you can use, deviations in costs versus deviation in progress. Plan versus actual cost and plan versus actual progress. So you can create your own Excel templates or any other ICT tool that you might use. This is a very simple setup, plan versus actual effort, i.e. person months, and you do it by task, typically. And this is just like a small snapshot out of a bigger Excel table. And this might end up like this. And then towards the end, you have planned versus actual for the whole, the whole consortium in this case. This is at an FP7-based template in Horizon 2020. If you look at financial monitoring versus monitoring the progress, then what you could get here is remaining budget, in the grant, sorry. And the remaining budget as a percentage of the grant, percent complete of tasks, and then a difference. Okay, so if you have, just to give an example, you have 10% remaining budget, you have 30% remaining, or like the tasks are 70% complete, i.e. 30% work to do, you have 10% budget left. Just an example of what you could see in this kind of a table. And then that would give you sort of the early warning signals, the things to discuss with the researcher. And then you have a different version here with more details. Yeah, I'm not able to read it, are you? Sorry. I'll have to move over here, sorry. And I normally see my own laptop when I run this projection, so I can look at the screen, but in this case I can't. Yeah, well, it's the same tables. Okay, the difference here is that we have a more detailed breakdown of the costs. So that's a different way to differentiate how detailed you want this to be. You could summarize everything in just costs in total, or you could do it by cost category and different levels of detail. I mentioned early on earned value management. This is a couple of charts. I've given you the source here because this is not something I produced myself. This is from NASA's webpage. They use it, and other public agencies in the United States use it. I think that's where it comes from, this whole notion. But I said it's planned versus actual value of what's been done. Just to show you that if you think this previous thing was too complex, you can always go one step further. Now we're getting onto a new subject, which is budget reallocations. By reallocations, I mean moving things around in the budget, basically. And that could happen at many levels, which I'll discuss in sequence. It can happen internally in one partner's budget, one beneficiary's budget, or between beneficiaries. And you also have a particular situation if a new partner is coming into the consortium, either as an addition or as a replacement for another partner that has been there so far. So the question to be asked when it comes to budget reallocations is first, is this a kind of reallocation that we need to ask the EU to approve before we do it? And that depends. But that's the first question that we should, or at least a very, very early question that we should ask. Can we just do it, or do we have to ask the EU first, the Commission, that is? There are some changes that require no approval. There are some changes that it would be smart to ask for approval, although it's not clear that it's really required. And there are some changes that where you can never get the cost accepted before you have the Commission's approval to change the budget first. One example is subcontracting costs and third-party costs of other varieties. If you read the grant agreement, it says that even though subcontracting this particular task was not mentioned in the grant agreement in Annex 1 to the grant agreement, which is the description of the action, even though this particular subcontracting was not mentioned, the project officer may approve it, but it's up to the project officer. So it's a gamble. If you just do it without asking approval before, ahead of time, then you may or you may not get it accepted, and the risk is yours. And in that case, when you ask for approval of like adding this subcontracting, which was not in the grant agreement, the project officer may say that, okay, we should have an amendment to the grant agreement to get this, to actually change the grant agreement so that it now is mentioned in the grant agreement. I was not going to talk about amendments here today. So if you have questions about amendments, you should ask. It was not something that I was planning to talk about. But the thing is, the basic issue is that there are certain budget changes where you should have an amendment or a change to the grant agreement. And always talk to the project officer first. That's the message. And let them decide. And I'll mention it now so that I don't forget later on, because it's not in any of my slides. It's better to ask the project officer one time too many than one time too little. Most project officers, they are all there to help you. It's in their interest that this project is a success. And most project officers, they would appreciate that you ask them, basically. So if you're not sure whether you should ask them, ask them. It's better to do it that way. Don't hold back because, oh, maybe the project officer doesn't want to be bothered. Don't think like that. Communicate with the project officer, and all these kinds of decisions that the project officer makes when the project is running, for instance, questions about should we have an amendment or not, make sure that you get this confirmed by email. It's often smart, the coordinator is the organization that communicates with the commission, with the project officer. So if you are a partner and you have an issue, you have to contact the coordinator and ask them to discuss this with the commission, or to bring forward your question and your suggestion to the commission. But it always has to go through the coordinator to the commission. Yeah?
What about when the coordinator is not willing to ask the question to the project officer? We've had situations like that.
Yeah.
We have an urgent question and the coordinator is not willing to do that.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a difficult situation because I can't remember the exact wording on this, and whether the official documents from the commissions say it very in absolute terms. that everything should go through the coordinator. I think it does, but it's so long since I've looked at this part of the documents, but I think that it says something in the grant agreement or in the annotated model grant agreement that one of the tasks of the coordinator is to act as the representative of the consortium towards the Commission.
Recall this concrete part of the grant agreement in order to make them communicate with the officers in our behalf.
I'm sorry?
So we have to recall on that particular part of the grant agreement and to use it as a tool to make our coordinator do their responsibilities according to the grant agreement.
Yeah, that could be one way of doing it. Find the text in the grant agreement which says that what the coordinator's responsibilities are. There is one part of the grant agreement, I can't remember the number of the paragraph or article, but there is one article which concerns internal division of responsibilities in the consortium, something like that. So that's where I would look. I mean, I know that there are cases where direct communication has been established between the project officer and partners, but the cases I've heard about, that has been suggested by the project officer. And that has to do with particular issues or challenges or problems that that partner had, and it was deemed more efficient to just have direct communications. But normally the Commission does not expect partners to approach the Commission directly. So yeah, one thing to do is to check that part of the grant agreement and refer to that in your communications with the project officer. And of course, as I said, in relation to the Commission, to have everything confirmed by email, also make sure that you can, in case of later problems, make sure they have emails that document that you have raised the issue with the coordinator. Yeah. Yeah, sorry.
We had similar problem with our leader that she didn't want to contact with the project officer, and after like 7 months, I forced her to just write the letter on the participant profile because of some issues, yes. And then we still didn't receive any answer from the project officer. And then I wrote to the project officer directly. But it's not so hard to find email because yeah.
We usually know what the project officer is, but they don't recommend it to go there and do that.
But at first what I did, just write to the leader in case of audit, I will show them that we couldn't get an answer from the project officer because of the leader, yes, because it was in a nice way to write to them and about responsibilities, yes, about this. And then after like 7 months of writing to each other, they decided to do this. And then, yes, and then we got like, after 4 hours, the answer back from the project officer. So I think sometimes it's good because, you know, right now you have a long history, yes, that you couldn't ask the project officer, yes. So then I can, if it's really important for you, for us it was really important, I would recommend you to just ask really kindly the project officer that it's unusual, but you have no choice because some kind of communication issues.
Yeah. At some point you may be forced to do it, but of course you would expect that going to that step of bypassing the coordinator and going directly to the Commission, that does not create a positive collaboration atmosphere. So there is a cost to doing that. So you don't, you should have a high threshold for doing that. And maybe, I don't know what the issue was, but there are certain issues that you could also ask to these general inquiry services, the help desks. of the Commission. I don't remember them off the top of my head, but there are certain help desk functions which helps anyone, not just coordinators, but any partner in any project. So if it's questions about are these costs eligible, or how should I report them, that might be another way of getting certain answers. I don't know if they would say, okay, this needs an amendment, because they would probably say that's up to the project officer. But other issues might be resolved that way, perhaps, depending on what the issue are. Yeah. Okay, and thank you. Any other questions? Yeah, this was related to this issue of budget reallocations and whether we should ask the EU for approval and whether it needs amendment and so on, and how the lines of communications are in resolving those issues. So we've been through that. And I mentioned this issue of subcontracting costs that were not in the grant agreement, whether that would need an amendment and so on, as an example of changing the budget, putting something in subcontracting which was previously, for instance, under other direct costs. Or it might have been under personnel costs if you planned to do it with your own people and then you discovered that you didn't have the right people to do it and you would have to get the service provided from outside. Might be another scenario. Okay, so let's just recapitulate these. These are the questions to be asked of whether or not approval from the Commission are required from the beneficiary point of view. And you say you have to ask the same questions being the coordinator when you look at the consortium as a whole, plus some additional questions. If there is a scenario where tasks are being reallocated between partners in the consortium, partner B is taking over task 4.1 from partner A. What we always have to keep in mind when we are the financial support staff is that cost levels are likely to be different. And 1 person month in partner B is probably not the same cost as 1 person month in partner A. And we always have to manage that. Of course, if the cost level is higher for the beneficiary who takes over the job, it may not necessarily mean that they will get a budget to match their higher cost level. And there are all kinds of scenarios that you could see in order to manage that situation. In some consortia, you will at a certain point see that there are clear indications that there will be leftover budget. Not all partners would spend all of the budget. So then you will be quite confident that you will be able to find some spare budget somewhere that could cover the fact that this partner's cost is higher, who's taking over the job. But we always have to ask the question, when we move person months from one partner to the other, what are the cost differences and how do we deal with that? If it's the other way, that this partner that takes over the task has lower costs, you should not necessarily just give them all the budget based on the higher costs, right? So again, new questions to be asked, and always ask the question, what are the real cost levels here, and how do we deal with the differences, whether they're positive or negative, and so on in a consortium. And this should always be transparent and above board. Also, a situation that may arise and which the coordinator has to look at and monitor is what I mentioned, budget imbalances within the consortium between partners. So look for indications of budget imbalances and how you could manage that. There are procedures that you have to go through when you reallocate budget between partners, and that should be written into the consortium agreement. and it should be written into the section 6, which is governance. If you refer to the DESCA template. The DESCA template, section 6, governance, tells you what are the decision-making processes and what kinds of decisions should be taken either at the General Assembly level or in like a steering committee or whatever it's called. That the name of this smaller group varies. But whatever it is, there's certain decisions that could be taken on that level, certain decisions that require a General Assembly decision. So make sure that as a coordinator, when we get to this issue of budget reallocation between partners, that we check the consortium agreement on how to do it, the formal decision making. When we get to the situation of adding and replacing beneficiaries, that's a more demanding procedure than just shifting budgets between partners. There are issues that we have to address and questions that we need to ask. We have to identify the tasks and the deliverables that are moved between partners. We have to determine what resources are required for these tasks. Resources meaning person months. It may mean consumables. It may mean equipment. It may even mean travel. So all the resources that sort of follow with that task have to be identified and then calculated into a budget calculation. And as I've said now, verify what the cost rates are for the different beneficiaries. Recalculate the budget. What was the budget before? What would the new budget be now? What are the differences? What are the differences? And how do we manage them? Depending on whether the differences are positive or negative and so on. Of course, like I've said many times, the max grant is the max grant. It could never be increased. It could always be lower. All consortia, if they see a scenario where in the middle of all of this, we actually have some spare budget left. We have more budget than we need based on these new calculations. The consortia never want to sort of give that back to the Commission. So that's where the consortia would agree on, okay, we have, at the moment, the costs that we have calculated are lower than the maximum grant. Let's see what happens later in the project. We may have new changes happening later on, which changes that situation the other way. Later on in the project, it may turn out that okay, some other cost item was more expensive, and it evens out that difference, for instance. Or it may happen that in one task, you need to do more work than you planned. It takes 2 more person months than planned to complete one particular task. So even though it looks like at one stage you have budget left over, that can change later on. Okay. So when the project is ending, then you have another scenario which could lead to budget reallocation. And that's the situation of what you could call overspend, underspend. Some partners have not spent all of their budgets. Others have spent more than their budgets. What the consortium could agree on then is to reallocate a budget from those who have underspent to those that have overspent. So partners that have spent, and by spend I mean the costs that have been reported and accepted in previous reporting periods, and the costs that they're now reporting for the final period. You add that up and you see that is lower than their part of the max grant, and you add up all the minuses and compare that with all the pluses on those that have spent more than their budget, and then you could propose to reallocate budget internally in the consortium. One reason being that if you use the DESCA template for the consortium agreement, one sentence there says something that if a partner spends more than their budget, they will only get funding up to their budget. If they spend less than the budget, they will only get the cost that they actually had. That is the DESCA in the DESCA template. I'm sorry, the text in the DESCA template. So that means that if you're going to do things formally correct when you get to this situation, and you see that there is overspend and underspend with partners, is that you actually have to have a general assembly decision on a new budget. Then everything is formally correct and compatible with the consortium agreement, because then some partners have a higher budget and they can get funded for this higher budget, basically. So keep in mind these formal procedures. I suspect that this formal aspect is not always taken care of in practice, and it probably doesn't create a problem, but beware of this fact that to be on safe ground, formally speaking, you should do this and take this into account. And in order to do that, that means that you don't have much time, because you should have this new budget approved by the Consortium General Assembly before you submit the final report to the Commission, which is 60 days after the end of the project. So that was it for before we get to the practical tips.
So, I don't know if I understood right, but after the end of the project, before the submission final report, we can remove, we can relocate the budget, we can relocate the money from one partner to another partner.
If everybody agrees. Because it's the internal...
But all costs should be like spent before the end of the project.
Yes, yeah.
So there's the debt, and then...
Yeah, what happens is that, costs are only eligible up to the end date, except for costs for producing the final report are eligible in the 60-day period after the end date. Those are the grant agreement rules, right? So but we have to base this decision on what we know as soon as possible after the end date. Partners, they should submit a draft financial statement in the participant portal. We normally say 20 to 30 days after the end date, something like that, because all partners need to be able to close their accounts for that month. And that typically takes a few days, and then they have to work on the financial statement and everything. So 20 to 30 calendar days after the end date is normally sort of a normal deadline for putting a draft financial statement in the participant portal. That's when you have the numbers. And that's when you see that when you add those numbers in the last financial statement to their numbers that were accepted for the previous periods, and you see how those sums compare to their part of the max grant. But so the Commission generally says it's okay for the consortium to reallocate budget internally. Although, as I mentioned earlier, there are certain changes that you cannot make without EU approval. But that's a different discussion. So if we leave that discussion aside, this internal allocation between the consortium, the EU says that that's okay, as long as the consortium agrees and as long as the consortium completes all the tasks in Annex 1, the description of the action.
Okay, I know that about the preparation budget from the Marquis Podolska, it's quite normal, but in this case, which you indicate, it means that we should like inform our
Better safe than sorry. I think it's a good idea to inform the project officer. Yeah, there's no reason to hide this from the EU. It's better to be transparent and open. So I would say it's good governance also, and in everybody's best interest to be transparent about this. Yeah. Because you're not doing anything illegal anyways, and if the project officer is skeptical about this, we should let them tell us. We should give the project officer a chance to tell us if they don't like it, basically. But as far as I can see, there should be no reason why they should object to it. As long as you don't have these cost categories where that needs to be in a grant agreement, you know. Any other questions? Yeah.
I would still have one question regarding personal costs. So let's say you have researchers working on the project until the last month. Obviously, they will get their wage after the end of the project. So is this eligible, or we should always manage it so that in the last month, only the administrative staff preparing the final report is working on the project? No more paid research.
You're talking about the last month before the end date in the grant agreement. I mean, it's different in Norway. It's different because our salary is paid in the same month. So we're being paid continuously in the month that the salary is for, and not a month after. But I would argue, this is just my reasoning, that because your principle is the way it is, it would be eligible, because it is what I would call incurred costs. You have incurred the obligation, I mean, your university has incurred the obligation to pay the salary for work being done in that month. So it's a clear obligation, and you have it documented by timesheets and so on, and by contract that this person did this work, it was for this project, and it happened in this month. So there's no doubt about the obligation to pay this, and it should definitely be eligible. Yeah. Clear opinion on that. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Are you ready for some tips and tricks before we shift the subject? Then we have to start a different presentation. Could we open the other file? So you'll see some of the same slide titles repeated now, so it might be a useful repetition so that it really sticks with you, the message. But I'll change some of the content to try to focus more on practical tips on how to deal with things.